In order for the Europeans, starting with the French fur trade and into the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, in order for them to get these beaver, they had to bring items to the First Nations tribes and trade things that they wanted to get the different furs. The types of items that the natives particularly cared for and were searching for were things that weren't made of bone and hide and whatnot that they had traditionally started with. Fur trade blankets that were traded to the natives were made in England from wool and are extremely warm and durable. The weight of them was rated by points, and this blanket here indicates a 4-point. If there was a half bar here, it would be a 3.5 point, and that determines the weight of the blanket. Prior to that, the natives were using hides. This is a piece of buffalo hide with the hair on, and this would be typical for making coats and sleeping. The teepees were made from the hides as well. The other items that the Europeans traded for there were many various hides that they traded for. This is an example of a muskrat. They called them rats in those days. This one has not been folded open, but there were hundreds of thousands of muskrat taken during the fur trade era. Rabbits, believe it or not, were abundant. This is a rabbit skin. There's one documentation from the Hudson Bay area where one winter they packaged up 100,000 rabbit skins. To trade, to get these furs, the Europeans particularly brought items such as beads. These are seed beads that the natives used for decoration, and we'll show you later how they applied those to some of their garmentry and whatnot. Snare wire. The natives had been trapping for centuries, and with snare wire, both in brass and in copper, they could make snares on the runs, and they also used this for making jewelry. They would make anything from wraps to tie their braids up with, to earrings, etc. The women were particularly fond of needles, steel needles, because they had been using bone needles and which tended to break and were bulky. These were nice and thin. They particularly liked thimbles in brass, and thimbles that were just in plain metal were a popular trade item. Bells, these are what are called hawk bells, which typically were tied to the feet of hawks that were trained for hunting, but these were used for decoration on their ceremonial clothing and whatnots for when they were doing their dancing. Again, hanks of beads of all different styles. The most popular were the blue beads, and then the white beads were the most popular color. Some of the other items that we've got here are fish hooks, steel fish hooks, which replace the bone fish hooks that the natives had made. These are a spade type head on them, and the string was wrapped around and tied onto that, and then with the abundance of fish, they didn't have much problem with these hooks in catching and retaining fish. The major supply for the fur trading forts during the fur trade area in most areas was fish, and white fish, and they would catch these fish and put them on sticks of tin and hang them in the storehouses, and where they would freeze, of course, and they were kept frozen, and then there was a daily allotment for food for the fort and to feed the dogs and whatnot that they used for the dog sleds as well. There was an exact inventory kept of how much went in, how much went out to each area, and how much was consumed, and they always knew how much they had left in the storage as well. In order to transport goods and whatnot, cassettes were used for mostly personal goods. This trunk is bigger than a normal cassette that a Voyageur would have. This would be more like a rations trunk that the Hudson Bay Company used, and we'll show you one of those later with some other goods. This is a wooden trunk with handmade steel hardware on it, painted with a milk paint finish, and would be used to carry the perhaps the medicines for the journey, some of the very delicate instruments of for the navigation, etc., those sort of things. Other items that were used, some were very detrimental to the First Nations, and that was what came in these kegs, was liquor, and mostly rum. Rum was brought over, and then it was cut by adding water to it in 4 parts to 1, depending on the area they were trading in and what the natives, what they could get away from cheating the natives in many ways, was how much they watered the rum down. Now these kegs filled with rum had to be carried into the wilderness as well by the voyageurs when they traveled. Other items that were used for trade that went along with the needles and whatnot were buttons of various types. These here are buttons that are made from deer antler. Then we have some brass buttons that have an attachment. Those were very popular. This is a pewter decorated button, a fancy button. And then there are plain pewter buttons. Now there were several sizes, and there were other ways. The natives also took buffalo horn. These are sections of buffalo horn that have been drilled to use as a button. So that became very popular in the fur trade as well.